So, as you know, this is a very broad-based issue here, and it's of interest to this church and many other congregations. And given the importance of this subject, we hope to challenge you with new thoughts, new insights, and hopefully you'll evaluate this and perhaps take some action, or in other words, engage with it on a deeper level than you might have before. We have a mission in this church to search and to serve. As Unitarian Universalists, we believe in the importance of searching for the truth and the importance of serving others. We organize these forums as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection, social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all. Why did we choose today's topic? What do the unchurched in the wider community believe? Are they former church or attendees or some other congregation? Are they spiritual but not religious? Are they humanists or simply believers in their own inner truth? Maybe some other form of non-physical reality. How do they make sense of the world, and what can we learn from them? These are all interesting questions. Our hearts and minds are open. And we have an excellent speaker this morning who can share his insights and wisdom on this subject. Dr. Allan, Georgia, our own Director of Lifespan Development, is our speaker. He's been with us since January, and I can't say enough about his personal contributions to us, individually, and to our entire congregation. Dr. Georgia has spent the last 15 years as an educator, scholar, and ministry associate, working in local churches, seminaries, and universities. His background has included church-related work in Western Cuba and Southern India, as well as Florida and Ohio. He's been in conversations with all kinds of Christian and Jewish religious communities and has lived in Shaker Heights since 2014 with his wife, Claire Lemfier. Dr. Georgia is a scholar of the highest order. And I can also say he's an engaging nerd with a good sense of humor. We have to balance these things. He is passionate about deep ideas, history, art, and many subjects of interest to all of us. Welcome, Dr. Georgia.
And definitely thank you so much for that. That's both a flattering and inviting way to begin this this morning. I'm so pleased to be here. As Susan mentioned, I am the director of Lifespan Faith Development here at this church. So in other words, this is ostensibly one of the things that I, support in my whole process, but in reality, Susan is the boss of this entire thing, and I have almost nothing to do with it. So today I get to wear an interesting hat, and I'm excited to do so in addressing this topic. I want to note that in 2018, I would say First Unitarian is not alone. Most churches in America live in a state of somewhat disappointed expectations on a Sunday morning. Because week by week, the masses that show up on any given Sunday morning seem to represent a diminishing return of who we expect or would hope is supposed to sort of show up. In a nation of immigrants such as ours, it's not entirely correct to say that we're becoming less religious on average, but it is definitely the case that our religious landscape is changing, and the most dramatic shift is unquestionably among those under the age of 35, the so-called millennials. I can claim just on the outset, the religious category, but one that's, they tend to be white, they tend to be the children of either traditionally Christian or Jewish parents, and part of the upper or middle classes. When people who gather in churches wonder where the young people are, this is commonly the group we're talking about. Now, to note, the goal of today's discussion is not to talk about how this group came to exist, or to talk about how they fit into the geographical and social makeup of America, or to speculate on what might coax them back into organized religion. Instead, I'm basing today's talk on a fairly basic assumption about the nature of religion, which is that it evolves and changes over time, and that the so-called nuns are not irreligious or anti-religious per se. Instead, I think that our descriptions of them might just be insufficient for how they actually experience the world. And so our terms are not up to the task to really capture the way in which nuns are in fact religious in some meaningful sense. To again be perfectly clear with all of you, I am not a demographer and I am not a sociologist at all. I am not someone who can be expert in the questions of geography and population and those kinds of survey questions that surround today's subject. What I am is a theologian. And to be even more specific for today's work, I am a descriptive theologian. So my goal today is not to rehearse the complaints of the nuns or to defend their actions. Neither is it to tear down their kind of informal religious ideologies, though I am not entirely uncritical of some of the trends I do see among the nuns. Instead, my goal is to attempt to describe and understand what they do believe. In some cases, these beliefs are informed by generational and social realities. In other cases, these beliefs are simply part of a complex set of intellectual, social, and cultural dimensions that we could never meaningfully untangle. But to be clear from the outset, what I present today is an attempt to summarize an interpretation of their beliefs. In all of these cases, I'm relying on the insights of many others. I didn't put together a formal bibliography, but if anybody had any questions, I'd be happy to put together some resources for you. So I'm relying on those sources, as well as my own experience with a generation that I can claim as my own, for good or ill. So let's just jump in. To begin, the premises and context for a nun's spirituality are really wrapped up in the formative experiences of what it is to be a millennial in America in some meaningful way. And I've pulled out a handful of categories of experiences that I think are very salient to understanding what makes the context of a nun spirituality sort of coherent in the 21st century. To begin with, the idea of young people being jaded when they arrive to adulthood is a very old story. And it's true that some cultural commentators have overblown the jadedness that characterizes millennials. But just as often, the crucial experience of having been given one cultural account as children and finding a completely different cultural reality when growing up is a defining feature of millennial experience. Consider the following vast global experiences that have faced those who came of age in the past 20 years or so. If you became an adult in 2000, 2 of 3 presidents in your adult life came to power and did so without winning a popular majority in their election. If you became an adult in the year 2000, the most successful attack on the U.S. took place after the result of a gigantic intelligence failure. Doubling down on the intelligence failure, a subsequent war in the Middle East that had a profound effect on your generation proved to be based on entirely false justification for a preemptive war. The Catholic Church has been revealed to be an internally corrupt organization at every level and in all nations, and the priesthood abuse scandal, as we all probably have read in the last few weeks, is entering an even darker chapter than it had been before. And right when you're ready to enter the job market, an unprecedented collapse in the global financial industry has proven to have wiped out basically the entire middle class and promulgated a period defined by an unprecedented wealth gap, in which the global 1% of the wealthiest people control an outsized amount of wealth in the world. Now, of course, everyone in this room experienced all of these realities. I think the thing to be charitable to the millennial experience is to realize that this is their only experience of the world. There is no bright past. There is no counter narrative to bring to bear into this experience. So there are a great deal of cliches about who millennials are and what characterizes their experience of the world, but this fundamental experience of having been told sort of a lie about what the world is, that only reveals itself to be untrue at the worst possible moment, is an experience that we can be very unsurprised profoundly affects how they think about religious institutions in particular. A dominant religious paradigm in Western thinking since certainly the classical period is the idea that there's a spectrum of ideologies that exist somewhere between the spiritual and the material. This goes back, of course, to Plato and before, that this is a distinction between an account of the world in which metaphysical claims, the idea of a world beyond us, the idea that our lives are not solely made up of the material things in our experience, versus an entirely materialistic explanation of the world, is basically the grand spectrum on which most religious ideologies sort of land. An interesting thing to note for millennials, and especially for nuns, is that it turns out that ideological rigidity is actually more of a turnoff than this, than landing on one side of the spectrum or the other. In fact, for many of these nuns, they are just as self-distancing when it comes to ideologically rigid atheist points of view, like those espoused by people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, as they are of fundamentalist religious points of view that we would expect from more conservative areas. What's remarkable about this fact is that it completely undermines a classic philosophical distinction in favor of what is ultimately an ethics of knowing. As I will discuss later, this puts the very concept of faith into a different paradigm altogether, and it creates a different set of values for thinking about what belief signifies for those who seem to have become exhausted by competing claims on what is provably true. In short, nuns have grown up in an argument they are sick of hearing, and for which they have little patience. Moving forward, and a little bit attached to that previous point, is that in the absence of a well-developed system of what we can call authorizing knowledge, in other words, in the absence of some kind of meta account of how the world functions, the existence of technologies and communications in our day-to-day lives have really magnified the effects of understanding how our habits impact the world. And interestingly, this has made nuns and millennials hyper-aware of how real our choices are in the world. So ironically, while there's been a loss of a kind of grand account of our ethical responsibilities, there's become a kind of hyper-development on the idea that there's an awareness that this thing that I do, this plastic cup that I consumptively got this morning that will eventually end up in the ocean and whatever, is now a live part about how I think about ethics, or I should say how a millennial will think about ethics. So in the place of these things, there is now a common sense driven understanding of morality based on basically doing no harm, and their assumption is that this should be universally understood without requiring a broader moral account of why it should be the case. A good example of this is the explosion of what's called cause-related marketing, and here I have, this is an image from Tom's shoes. It's very possible there might be a pair of Tom's shoes in this very room. I'm not sure. It would be in a Unitarian church if it would be anywhere. But if you don't know how Tom's shoes works, you go to a store, you purchase a shoe that, let's say, doesn't look like it costs as much as the price tag suggests that it does, but the implication is that actually it was you purchased this pair of shoes and an exact same pair of shoes will be given charitably to somebody in the third world who does not have access to shoes. It's a neat little trick. So the very idea that you can consume but then negate the harmful effects of your consumption is a kind of fundamental way in which a millennial kind of ethics would see the world. That this is a way to acknowledge the damaging effects of consumption and trying to mitigate it at the same time. That being said, and having talked about this, it's important to note that this idea of a basic common sense informing morals is actually a really profound claim about what it is to be human on at least a few levels. First, an important thing to note is that unlike previous kind of counter-religious critiques, this is not a criticism of traditional notions of sin or accounts of human capacity toward evil. Instead, this is a claim about the instinctual civility of all people that's analogous to more like how we talk about health. That all people are not only basically good, but also that most people have a basic understanding of what that goodness means in their day-to-day lives. Second, the assumption here is also very casually held by people who feel this way. In other words, it's not the result of a rigorous line of thinking or some kind of a grand conclusion about the nature of what it is to be human. It's just an assumption that if you don't understand that X is wrong, there's something wrong with you. Okay. Final thing to note is that, for this context piece, is to note that there is an interesting development that comes out of this idea of morality happening at this individual level, which is that there's an interesting other development in the millennial sphere, which is that very, very uncharacteristic of the generations that preceded it, millennials are extremely political. In fact, they're the most political generation since that generation that defined the 1960s. An obvious read of this change in political activism would be to see millennials as optimistic, plugged in, and politically savvy. But their activism is also correlated with a decline not only in religious affiliation, but also in any kind of participation in voluntary associations where soft forms of power and social persuasion can be part of how one acts politically in the world. So what it seems is that millennials are not optimistic. Instead, they are cripplingly cynical about the idea that any kind of active engagement in the public sphere that does not win absolute hard forms of power have any effect whatsoever. This has also meant that, unlike older conservative activists who have tended to emphasize local, state, and congressional political activity, millennial activists are cold on forms of power that do not impact significant dimensions of American life. As a case in point, the Bernie bro. This is a term we had learned in the 2016 election when a profound number of younger millennials gravitated toward the Bernie Sanders presidential bid. It turns out that a millennial is much more likely to support an out-of-state political voice, regardless of that voice's party affiliation or age, as long as they present a platform of relevant legislation that speaks to the experience of individual millennial needs. So in other words, a millennial is much less likely to support an in-state legislature candidate who's going to have a net positive good. They're going to think less pragmatically about the effect of their political engagement. They are instead only going to put themselves forward in those cases where a concrete win will be winnable to their experience. Okay. So these to me are just a sampling of things, but the point is that these broad characteristics of what it is to be a millennial are some of the contexts that inform what it is to have this non-spirituality, this different way of thinking. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about what it is to believe among the nuns. I'm using the word textures here, and the goal there is to acknowledge the fact that the nuns, of course, do not have an organized religious account of any type whatsoever, so of course I couldn't offer one here. But instead what I'm trying to describe is a tendency or a set of criteria that seem to characterize large numbers of those who identify as non-religious. So some example, or some dimensions of belief among the nuns. The prevailing discourse around religious belief from which a nun brings his or her ideas is one in which religion is pitted against, is not one where religion is pitted against skepticism, science, atheism, etc. Rather than siding with one of these, a nun has intuitively deconstructed dimensions of religion and frequently claims the term spirituality to describe those things that are volitional to the individual and which coincide with an interior sense of how you see the world. So in this paradigm, spirituality is opposed to religion in terms of its claims of certainty and what is knowable. So for all practical purposes, spirituality becomes a whole category of things that are subjective, that classify individual experience, and certainly factor into how any individual sees the world. But the negative correlative to this concept of spirituality is not materialism or science. It's actually the idea of organized faith, as organized faith. Additionally, this is very much my readout of this, and you can tell my educator status is biasing me perhaps a little bit, but because of this individualization, and also because cutting off from all of these traditional religious paradigms of Western religion have cut off the possibility of seeing education or learning or development as a model for what the spirituality is supposed to look like, the most prevailing metaphor for spirituality among nuns is that of health. So the way in which a nun will talk about spirituality is not primarily in terms of a life of development or evolution or progress, but rather in terms of having or being in a healthy place or being in a kind of intoxicated, negative kind of a claim. So the language that develops out of this is a language of metaphoric therapy, basically. So it's about eating spiritually well. It's about giving time to your spiritual fitness. It's about putting things together in such a way that you have a spirit that is well cared for. That's sort of the analogy that's there for nuns. And it certainly has borrowed a great deal of language from the realms of psychology and psychotherapy. So therapeutic model for spiritual belief. God might be the most interesting dimension of how nuns talk about spirituality, and I'm actually going to get to a deeper point about this when I get to a little section on curiosities here. But a thing to note is that God, or the characteristics of the God, are not part of the root of the religious experience for a nun. Without a doubt, the root of religious experience for a nun is the subjective experience of what it is to be an individual. So instead, the conception of God allows nuns to imagine a range of possibilities. So nuns might believe, for instance, that we are all a oneness that constitutes God in some fundamental way. Perhaps the oneness means that each one of us individually is in fact divine. Perhaps there is a God, this is an interesting nun point of view, perhaps there is a God, but maybe that God just doesn't really care about us. Perhaps there is instead an indifferent source of spiritual energy in the universe that has no personal dimension, but for which we can tap in interesting ways. So in other words, for nuns, God is not an answer to a question. Instead, God is a venue for all kinds of subsequent questions. Okay, one of the most profound dimensions of religion in American life, certainly in the past, well, forever, I guess, is the way in which religion becomes an important element of identity, and specifically of community identity. In certainly a place like Cleveland gives us a great history of immigrant cultures bringing their religious with them, and that being an identifying element of any one group. What I can say is that this idea is as foreign to nuns as an idea could be. Of course, the fact that they're coming out of a largely white, largely upper middle class environment is a factor there. But it turns out that for most nuns, the very idea of religious identity is no longer going to be tied to family heritage or ethnicity. It's instead going to be tied to the very particular experiences that may be forged or informed any one individual's spiritual life. I will note, just in passing, an interesting discussion of how this functions in real life in the Netflix show Master of None, in which the comedian Aziz Ansari dedicates an episode to what it's like navigating an essentially nun-type approach to religious identity, while also being the child of first-generation immigrants from India, and what it's like to sort of live in both of those worlds. Okay. Sorry, I'm keeping an eye on time here as well. I want to note also, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, is that millennials especially, but nuns certainly as a group within the millennials, have a very unusual relationship to moral questions and ethical questions. they seem to be of the highest concern to this group, and yet, as I noted before, there is no developed account to sort of give an explanation for how these moral ideas come to be. So what I would suggest is that nuns could be characterized as morally naive. Their ethical thinking is instinctive. It's often guided by cultural and market forces rather than first principles. And it's, as a result, largely uninstructable in the sense that the basis for these kinds of conversations is usually wrapped up in the same resistance to theology as their instinct about religion. What I want to note is that this is not a strength of nun spirituality. This is going to be a real problem going forward. Even though it sounds extremely reasonable in its place, the idea of saying that if you don't know this thing is wrong, there's something the matter with you, is not going to be a durable way in which you create truly accountable and responsive moral systems. So this is a real problem, I think, for nuns going forward. I'm going to talk about this in greater depth as well in our curiosity section, but belief functions in a very unique way among the nuns, especially taking into account its central role in the Christian religious tradition as a fundamental way in which the beginning of one's faith is characterized. For nuns, belief is an accomplishment, an achievement, more than it is a premise of a resulting faith. So the very idea of getting to something that you believe for a nun is going to be the result of a spiritual experience that precedes the belief itself. This is actually something that I would say is analogous to some of the wisdom traditions in early Judaism and Christianity, but also certainly those traditions in Buddhism. There's much more of this idea that belief is the result of an experience, the result of something outside of oneself, rather than this paradigm that we're used to in a Western religious context of this thing that precedes your religious identity. Okay, the final one is a little different because for all of these other points I'm trying to say this is how nuns describe and experience religion. In this case, I'm actually trying to acknowledge and notice the things that nuns also are doing that may be religious in a dimension, and that actually relates to bodies and rituals. The idea of the regulation and definition of our bodies, and also rituals as a way in which we navigate our spaces and our experience of time. These are fundamental experiences that are religious in every part of human culture forever. But of course, these things are not really formalized in any meaningful way among nuns. So looking instead at what nuns, and in this case I'm really just looking at millennial culture, is, and I was thinking about this in terms of ways that religious practices might be showing up in unexpected places. So an example. Consider the explosion of tattoos, especially among those 40 and younger. This was a staggering statistic to me. In 2000, 15% of Americans were tattooed. In 2017, 42% of Americans had become tattooed, and 19% said they would consider getting one. Okay, so that's something. At the same time, exercise, sports, and other forms of physical training have suddenly exploded in this extremely ritualistic direction. We now have Soul Cycle, yoga of various forms, CrossFit, which everybody seems to think is a cult. Physical training has now actually become highly associated with forms of community and rigorousness in one's bodily life that actually looks a great deal like religious practices from other parts of the world. Something a little bit closer to home is seeing how social media and the expansion of conversations about our calendar have begun to affect how we think about time. So I was noticing how much in the age of social media, we have all kinds of observances and days that begin to fill our calendar, and especially on places like Facebook and Twitter, are suddenly being talked about in much more public ways. So for instance, in September, to just limit myself to 5 examples, September is Classical Music Month, German American Awareness Month, National Honey Month, Sickle Cell Awareness Month, and Trucker Appreciation Month. I'm not suggesting that any of these are bad or that it's a problem that we're observing all of these days, but is it possible that the preponderance of these new holidays is us as a society trying to make up for something we have lost? Okay. So, talking about our textures of belief, I wanted to address a few unexpected dynamics. And one is the idea that religious stakes are beginning to show up in things that do not seem ostensibly religious in any meaningful sense. This was the subject of great controversy, extraordinary controversy for an ad campaign in these last few weeks. So this is the new Nike ad featuring Colin Kaepernick. This is actually right at 42nd Street, right above Modal's sports store in right near Grand Central Station. So this is the sign, but consider the actual slogan that is used here and is on the sign itself. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. Well, if that is not a motto for belief as achievement, I do not know what is. And the idea that we've actually have an athlete representing it really shows just how absolute that transformation of the concept of belief has become. Notice that this is not explicitly religious, but if you are a nun, this overlaps with your own spiritual questions. Kaepernick in this reading is the winner of a profound battle, and the consequences of his belief are not about who he is, but about what he does. So in this encapsulation, we see how spirituality is now functioning outside of paradigms that are explicitly religious. So this is one example. Somewhat related, actually, I didn't have a slide for this one. Somewhat related, certainly related to Colin Kaepernick, is ways in which the kind of tearing down of boundaries related to religious thinking has now affected religious discourse. And I think about this frequently with the prevalence of the phrase woke. I don't know if this is on everyone's radar necessarily. Ostensibly, this is part of African American conversations about social awareness, but the imagery of wakefulness as knowledge is something that goes back to ancient religious communities. To be woke is not analogous to being hip or informed or even in fashion. The phrase explicitly is about knowing something in such a way that it's transformative to who you are. It's the kind of knowing that actually affects the very person that you exist at some fundamental deep down level. In this case, the thing to know and understand is, in brief, that we live in a society that conspires to hold down minorities and women. And the idea is that to be woke is now going to fundamentally change how you operate in the world altogether. What I would say is that what's remarkable here is that this is language that is not, it's identical to what you would see in all kinds of mystical wisdom traditions throughout history. My final example, I'm sorry, I guess I'm skipping my final example, and I'm jumping instead to curiosities. So this is ways in which religious discourse is showing up in interesting ways that are unexpected out of the nun sort of experience of the world. My first example comes from Bo Burnham, who is a millennial comedian. He's also now a movie director and has been doing some other things as well. His shtick is that he kind of writes songs that are funny. And the whole premise is that he's sort of singing in sort of a concert and comedy, very Steve Martin-esque. One of the songs he writes on this particular album is, I think it's titled literally, The Song from God's Perspective. And this is really interesting because God is actually a really important operator in this nun spirituality in terms of how Bo Burnham is describing the world. But basically, the essence of the lyrics that Bo Burnham writes is a God who is basically saying, why on earth do you think I would ever care to hang out or have anything to do with you? I think the chorus for the song is something like, you're never going to go to heaven because there are 3 million aliens who are way cooler than you are. And at a similar time, to see the discussion of morality I brought up before, one of his other lines is God saying something to the effect of, the idea that you should have to hear from me that you shouldn't rape people is messed up. You should just know that you don't need to rape people. That's the sort of message. I also have this. This is an example of a social media post making light of contemporary Christian music, and this becomes an interesting dimension of nun spirituality as well. If you are not existing in the nun paradigm, the very concept of a personal God among nuns is described actually frequently as something that's a little creepy. And the idea that a God that is hyper-aware and hyper-involved in your life is actually stalker-esque and is sort of a way of imagining God as an interloper in your life as opposed to someone who is there for positive kinds of reasons. And finally, especially having really emphasized the moral issues with a nun's spirituality, I wanted to point out this television show that's currently on NBC called The Good Place. And I raise this because this is the first time I've certainly ever seen on television an actual moral philosopher as a character on television who actually has books of moral philosophy, and the show actually engages some of these ideas. What's remarkable, of course, is that these are well established, like the information is available, it's all out there. This show, of course, because it's on television, is acting as if these are all brand new discoveries. Did you hear about this? There's actually, we could think about these ideas in bigger ways. So The Good Place is actually a television show. The whole premise is that Kristen Bell's character has died and gone to heaven, but she was actually supposed to go to hell. And she's kind of trying to make her way and figure out how to negate her life of, in this case, she's not evil, she's just very selfish and, kind of a narcissistic person. So it's fraught with all kinds of questions and really great discussions about morality and ethics. Okay, what will nuns bring to the world? And by this, this is by way of conclusion to at least think about some ways moving forward that's going to affect how we experience spirituality among this group. First thing to note is, having spent so much time talking about the beliefs and spiritual experiences of nuns, I want to emphasize that religion isn't going anywhere. That for all of the dominance of this group in this age group, America remains an extremely diverse place, and for all of the difficulties we're seeing in many denominations, these are not organizations that are going to fold up and disappear at any point in time. So whatever happens going forward is going to, by nature, be a negotiated reality among people. But what I will say is that nuns are also going to be people who frequently actually show up in places like this. They're going to be people who bring their own spiritual instincts to some of the traditional conversations. Some of that is going to be very positive, because this is actually a group that's very open-minded to theological diversity. But also they're going to have their own values and their own concerns that are going to frequently have space at the table, whether we sort of like it or not. The other thing I want to note is that we are at the same time facing, I say impending, but it's really well underway, an educational crisis. It turns out that the humanities and liberal arts are very bad for business. And as a result, anything having to do with the study of what it means to be human outside of that paradigm has increasingly lost any kind of bandwidth in academic and religious discourse. When you pair this with the kind of de-emphasis of traditional religious institutions, it's very easy to imagine a scenario in which large, massive groups of people have absolutely no sense whatsoever, not only about the basics of what religious or philosophical questions are, but even the very existence of those questions whatsoever. Increasingly, it's hard to imagine what that world will look like, but there doesn't seem to be a replacement venue currently in existence that's going to fill this role in some meaningful way. I also want to raise that there's a very unclear legal future when it comes to nuns and their spirituality. Of course, one of the most important elements of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is freedom of religion, and currently this idea of no religion is a really weird way to describe a group that really actually has a lot of beliefs that may at some point in time come into a constitutional conflict. It's hard to imagine what that will look like, but there certainly are legal implications to this idea. Trying to really end on some kind of a positive note, I want to note that we are also, I hope to God, ending the idea of the post-society. I would say for really the end of, more than that, it's 50 years of the 20th century, everything was conceived of in terms of a looking back, in terms of a loss. So we were variously living in a post-Christian, a post-Enlightenment, a post-structuralist. We were post-everything. In other words, there had always been some diminishment, something we had passed by us. What's interesting to note is that the nuns are perhaps the first group of people to actually look back at some of this material and see it with fresh eyes. They have no particular relationship to it necessarily. There's no allegiance there or non-allegiance. And so whatever it is that they pick out of that is newly won. It's no longer wrapped up in questions about what had gone before. And that, for one thing, is an optimistic way of imagining a creative way forward as opposed to some kind of retrenchment about past ideas. Nuns are not worried about a past that does not inform their present. They're concerned about the world in front of them and the world they are working to bring into existence. They are building a spirituality that comes from their experience and responds to their contexts. They are true scavengers and explorers of necessity. They look around them knowing that the world in which they live has long been occupied, and they make their way forward to discover the world without any sense that maps written in the past can be used to reliably plot the way forward. That is all I have, so thank you all very much.
Thank you. I think most of you are already on our email list, so I'm going to pass these around just in case you're not, because if you want to receive information about future forums, give your name and email address, and we will see that you are on the list. And I also want to say we are transitioning into the question and answer section, and there's 3 rules for the Q&A. The first one is keep your questions short. The second is keep your mouth close to the microphone so we can hear. And the third is no speeches, please. So anyway, I will start these. I think everyone here on the first is all started here. And we'll just keep it going.
Thank you for that brilliant lecture. Question, how does this affect racial divisions, given that you describe this as a phenomenon of upper middle class whites? So does that sort of just encourage a continued division?
I think this is a very, very good question. And the reason I would make the distinction and why we classify the nuns in this way, and this is where I have to again say I'm not a demographer, so I can't claim knowledge of the methodology exactly, but we actually in our surveys, like in the Pew surveys themselves, we distinguish between Black Protestant and Protestant. And the reason for that is because I think from a descriptive sociological standpoint, actually these churches function very differently with respect to their communities. So what I will say is that this is not something, some of these dynamics are not absent from the African American experience, but their relationship to traditional religion is going to be very different than the experience of an upper middle class, suburban white family. So there are going to be interesting interchanges in some of these cases, and an interesting way of looking at that would be, ways in which I would say you could point to Black activists of younger generations having a much more fraught relationship to churches and their relationship going forward. I'm trying to think of a good example, but actually just very recently, the funeral for Aretha Franklin and the huge criticism that emerged for the eulogy that was kind of a traditional evangelical message from a Black minister was actually by most of the African American social media community was a missed opportunity and a really tone-deaf way to treat her passing. So it's interesting to see how those dynamics would play differently, but I take them out of the conversation because I think there's a different narrative going on there.
Question here. In your evaluations, I got the impression that this group is unconscious of the ways that they are dealing with the uncertainties of their environment. Is that a
Is that fair?
reasonable
Yeah, okay.
assumption?
I would say not that they are unconscious. What I would say that I think is a fair characterization is that they are hyper aware of the pragmatic realities of their experience, and they are almost completely uninterested in the idea that those would have some larger significance beyond their individual experience. I think one of the most defining dimensions of a nun's spirituality and sort of millennial experience is that you don't you don't jump from the individual to the communal. That relationship is almost never understood to be relevant in any meaningful way. So I would say it's right to characterize that they're unconscious of the larger kinds of questions, but it's usually because they are, I think, to be charitable to them, they're trying to pay their bills and they're working 2 jobs and they're struggling with all the things of life, so they're not really concerned with these bigger questions.
Question here?
Hi, Allan. What about when these millennials have children? Are they dealing with having children any differently than the rest of us do? Is at that point, does it become more important?
Oh, you mean like does traditional religion show itself?
Right, does
Yeah.
a religiosity, if you will, a teaching or training of some sort
Yeah.
become important?
So what I will say is that I'm sure there are numbers out there, I don't have them off the top of my head. So it would be interesting to see what we could survey in terms of the idea of like a return for anybody who has sort of stepped away. What I will say is that this actually raises an interesting question, which is that we have the nuns as a group, sort of separate from a group that would identify as mainline Protestant or evangelical Catholic or what have you. An interesting thing to note is how much, not this whole paradigm, but maybe parts of this paradigm are showing up in people who would identify as mainline Protestant or Catholic or what have you. And what I would say is that there might be more of a negotiation there on the part of parents who are, but what I will say about like our own numbers is on net, it's not growing. So more and more parents, for just by the definition of the numbers, are finding it not necessary, or they're finding other ways to do it.
Just out of curiosity, what does this in any way portend to the possibility of an increase in the membership in Unitarian congregations? And should we finally get around to seriously considering placing our Super Bowl ad?
I can't speak to the Super Bowl ad because there are budgetary concerns there, I imagine. But what I actually can say is I'm sorry to say some bad news, which is that one of the ways that we actually measure the kind of effect of traditions holding on to and kind of continuing going forward is through retention of youth. So what I will say is that pretty standard is I heard the Presbyterian Church retains about 50% of their youth. So about 50% of youth who grew up in the Presbyterian Church when they are the age of 40 or something in that range will still claim to be Presbyterian. Among Unitarian Universalists, that number is, I think, 12%. And it's actually the lowest number. One thing to note about that is if you grow up in the Unitarian Universalist tradition, your experience as a youth has almost no connection whatsoever to what it is to be an adult as a Unitarian Universalist. What I will say is that Unitarian Universalist children are certainly going into the world with a great deal more religious education than most of their peers. So they're actually probably negotiating this landscape better, but they may be doing it outside of UU churches.
Question right here.
How important do you think nuns or millennials in general will be to our midterm elections?
That's a very good question. They were not super helpful in the 2016 election, so it is actually it's hard to say. One thing I can say is, sort of going back to my one political point about this, is that, and I wonder about this when I hear political commentators talk about this, but if a platform is coming at this generation with a discussion of the greater good, or some kind of communitarian type account of government, even though that is completely reasonable and that is actually a very good way to develop policy, I will say most millennials simply do not make time for those kinds of concerns. One of the things I actually skipped over this point, but it's worth noting that millennials are, and I say this looking at this room, so please don't hate me here as I describe this, but we're the first group to get screwed by our parents. And I mean this in very real kinds of ways. Every generation of Americans has had a brighter future than their parents had. Millennials do not have a brighter future than their parents have. We have a lower life expectancy. We have a lower instance of health insurance coverage. We have lower opportunities for job and home ownership. we are 100% certain that we're going to live in a less climatologically habitable world. It is maybe not good politics, but it is not unreasonable that this group doesn't much care about dimensions in political conversations that don't immediately speak to their experience. So what I can say going forward is that we are probably going to be shifting to a paradigm in which political constituencies are much more responsive to their immediate experiences. Now, that could be positive in some ways. That could mean greater emphasis on unionization. It could mean, greater emphasis on, as we see in lots of these urban areas where millennials are a large part of the voting bloc, emphasis on the importance of minimum wage laws and things like that. So it's hard to say what the actual outcome will be, but I do think we are seeing a real significant shift.
Thank you, Allan, for an excellent presentation. If we're going to have community in church, and we're not selling any longer redemption and an afterlife and why sin exists, what are we selling to the millennials? Is it a matter of community? Is it a matter of provocative curiosity? Is it a matter of relationship with others who might help you in the business world? I mean, what is it that we as a church offer, any church?
So this is a golden question. This really is a big one, and this fortunately spills into that area that I said in my intro I wasn't going to cover, so I can sidestep it if I'm so inclined. But what I will say is I just asked somebody yesterday, somebody in my generation, I was sort of curious. I was like, just off the cuff, why don't you go to church? And their response was, it's a chore.
It's what?
It's a chore.
Chore?
Yeah.
Sure.
And so, and I say that, I'm sure that experience, the idea of experiencing church as a chore, is not unique to millennials per se. But what I think it does speak to is the idea that the paradigm of organized institutional religion for most of this group is some kind of a requirement imposed upon them in their youth that they have lost any sense of need for it. What I can say unequivocally is that this is not a group that has no needs. If they're not here, it might be because we're not addressing those needs and taking those needs seriously. So what I will say going forward is there is definitely a way to do it, but I don't know that under our current paradigms we're really going to have the vocabulary to imagine what that would look like.
Good morning and thank you. I appreciate what you shared with us early. I don't know if it's a question, but it may be. I might fit in that category. I'm not certain. But in the beginning, you mentioned about 6 things that kind of says that there hasn't been very many really positive things that happen. And I thought about that. And I have to agree, you're right. But there was one thing that truly happened that was so positive that I never expected to see it or know about it. And that was a black man becoming president in the United States of America. Not once, but twice he was elected. And that's a broad, that's just not black folks. That's black folks voting for him did not get him in the picture.
Yeah.
The other thing is, it's not so much my understanding of God. I know I will never know what that is. But it's, for myself, it's about peace of mind. And the church isn't going to give me peace of mind. I have to bring that to myself. Politics is not going to give me peace of mind. I have to give that to myself.
Totally. One thing to note about your final point, and I will say your first point is an extremely valid one. I would love to poll some of the people represented by this and get a sense of how they interpreted the Obama election, for which they were a large constituency of the success of that bid. So that is a very interesting point. As far as the idea of comfort and peace of mind, and I wish I had some good examples here in front of us, but a really remarkable element of social media recently is the advent of memes. It's very possible very few of you think in terms of memes, but I assure you this has become part of the lingua franca of what it is to be a younger person. You see some of these on Facebook from time to time, little images, pictures, things like that that communicate some sort of deeper idea. A stunning amount of recent memes that express a sense of isolation, a sense of existential dread, a sense of pointlessness. This has become actually a really common element of memes coming from precisely younger people. People who are finally finding a venue to express some of those anxieties that traditionally religion has sort of addressed. So all I can do is bring this back to Jack's sort of question and say, I think there is something that we can be doing here to better address what you're describing. Even though I think you're right, it's still up to each of us individually. But there still is such a thing as creating a discourse that gives people support to reach that peace of mind and to come to a place where they're content in their experience of the world. So I hope we think more about that going forward.
This really just follows your question on social media. Because in our generation, we had person-to-person communication around the kitchen table with grandparents or friends or family who shared their experiences in a personal level, face-to-face, that was meaningful. And I know now that social media has taken over a large part of the lives of these young people at a stage when they're trying to discover their identity, who they are. Who are you when you're 18 or 22 or 26? That's a developmental stage when you're still exploring boundaries, finding out how you're different or the same for other people. And again, social media is an enormous entity. I'm just wondering about some of these churches and congregations joining each other in an organizational way via social media to reach out on some level to these various social networks that I'm not good at, not aware of, can't relate to. But if that's the modus operandi, it's not the Bible, but maybe social media is the platform that we should be looking to explore ways of reaching and engaging. I'm not saying with messages, I'm just saying lift up the questions that might attract some attention and start the conversation, because we can't do it person to person since social media is so enormous. That's what I'm just thinking through.
Yeah, so I think it's that's a very there's a very logical way in which that's a good way to think of finding sort of this group of people sort of where they're at. I think an important thing to bring into this conversation, though, and it's an easy assumption to make, is that people who spend a lot of time in a place must love that place. I think that if you talk to plenty of young people, they might describe social media as something that happened to them more than they would describe it as this wonderland that they are so glad they get to experience. We're actually on this point, there's an interesting cycling around now. We're actually coming to the point now where people are, this happened to me during coming of age this last year, where I had a young girl who came up to me with her speech in hand. She had handwritten it. And I said, I need, we have to pass this out to other people. And she said, well, I don't know how to type. And I was like, what? How is it possible? How do you not know how to type? She's like, why? I don't have a computer. It's like, what? You have a computer in your pocket? And she said, well, yeah. She's like, yeah. I said, she's like, I can write on my phone. And I said, oh my God, I didn't even realize we've come all the way around. We, I think, in this room have a paradigm where social media is this new thing that has come and changed the world, but increasingly there are generations for whom this is simply the world. And why I raise that to say is that this might not necessarily be a venue in which we're going to find success by kind of like mimicking what's sort of out there. I think it's more that we have to evolve our own mechanisms of communication in such a way that we become as naturalized to it as sort of they are. And I don't think that's going to happen quickly or programmatically. I think it's going to be more of a shift over time. I would say that if we got a group together to try to like attack this strategically, what would come out of it is Probably something that is very well intentioned but does not ever quite hit its mark. That would be my sort of guess.
Thank you. Question here?
Great.
Social media has also brought together people face to face through meetup groups. There are meetup groups out there about every interest you can imagine, including philosophy, including religions of every type. So social media can also bring people into a face-to-face encounters with like-minded people.
Oh, absolutely. Well, in fact, one of the now classic millennial joke is in 1995, the wisdom you heard from your parents was never meet somebody from the internet and never get into a stranger's car. And now we're in 2017. I'm going to call somebody on the internet so they can drive me to some other place. This is now extremely ordinary. So yeah, we're living in a world where the idea of a division between the digital and the real world is increasingly thin.
Question?
Yes, I just want to support Susan's idea that Facebook is a good platform on which to reach these millennials. I own rental property, have owned it for more than 40 years, and when I had a vacancy a year ago, I advertised in all the local places, the newspapers, Craigslist, Case Western Reserve, zip, not even a single response. I called the city and I said, what am I going to do? And they said, advertise on Facebook. Well, I wasn't on Facebook, but I joined. 1 week later, I had tenants. That's the way to reach them.
Throughout your talk, you have been talking about how, for instance, political platforms that are geared towards the good of the community is not something that will really resonate with the millennials who are more concerned about individual needs. Why is it so difficult for them not to see the connection between the good of the community actually having a profound impact on their individual needs? For instance, you know, there are clear political choices about things that will affect their world, their environment, the continuation of healthcare coverage and Social Security. These are all things that will have a profound impact on the millennials, probably much greater than in older generations. Why is there that disconnect?
Well, I think you've gotten to a really good area that might actually sort of capture where that disconnect is when you bring up healthcare. So a good thing to note about this is, without getting into, of course, the fine points, and there are many fine points there, but the gist of Obamacare, you know, the Affordable Care Act, was that we had to equalize the system, which meant that a bunch of healthy younger people were going to have to pay more money. Now, as a policy, you know, idea, there was a reason for that, and it made a great deal of sense. But you can't imagine how a bunch of millennials who would have preferred just universal health coverage would resent the Jesus out of a system that was like, oh, just so you know, the minimum wage hasn't changed in like your lifetime. Mind you, in the state of Ohio, it's still $8 an hour. But we're going to charge you more for insurance because we have to make sure that your older parents and grandparents can have affordable coverage. That is a good and necessary policy given the politics of the situation, but what I think really captures what the millennial experience is to say, this is actually of no benefit to me whatsoever. There is a better policy, and a bunch of old, conservative, stodgy people are ensuring that this better thing that would benefit me is not happening. So why on earth would I care to support them? And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to send $15 to Bernie Sanders, who is, at least his platform, you know, portends both free college and Medicare for all. So just as like not to say that your point is incorrect, but to sort of, you know, capture one of the ways in which that dynamic is in front of them. that is an understandable health policy given the dynamics of the situation, and yet it precisely, not victimized, but it precisely paid for a group that millennials might classify as a greedy, using group of generations that had already sopped up a lot of very nice things in the world, and were using their money to pay for it.
Question?
Okay,
yeah,
this will be the last question.
That's fine.
This will be the
But,
last.
yeah, wonderful.
Pressure. So I want to say, as one of the few millennials in the room, it was very interesting sitting in on a conversation about myself. It was really weird, but not at all inaccurate for both pros and the cons. I very much saw myself in this conversation. But I just wanted to talk about social media. I think it very much, speaking from somebody born in 1988, social media was something that definitely, like, I participated in very willingly, but it happened to us, it happened to me, and I know a lot of people have been talking about, like, oh, Facebook is so great. I wouldn't get too attached to that idea, and I don't work for Facebook by any means, so I don't know the trajectory, but I have a lot of friends, myself included, that have taken hiatuses from Facebook because social media has kind of, it's been seen as an interloper. It has been seen as someone who, that stalker mentality of, like, they know so much about you that I have seen a lot of my friends, myself included, take breaks, some of them indefinitely. So I wouldn't get too attached to the idea of, like, using social media to reach out to millennials, especially Facebook, because I see, like, the generation under me, so, like, my friends' younger siblings, not even using Facebook, not even having Facebook. So yeah, that's just an interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing to note that sort of magnifies what you're saying is, in terms of them being there but not necessarily liking it there, for some people who maybe grew up where it didn't occur to them not to participate in social media, they might get to an age when they realize, oh, I actually don't have to do this. This isn't a requirement, even though it's naturalized to my own experience. So those changes could be, part of the conversation, certainly. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so very much here. I have a few announcements. Next Sunday on September 23rd, our forum is titled Antitrust, Competition, and the Future. We'll discuss monopolies like Amazon, Apple, Google, the closing of retail stores all around us, and the fact that 50% of all retail is now online. Dr. Christopher Sagers from the CSU Cleveland Marshall College of Law and an expert on antitrust will lead our discussion. On September 30th, we'll have a panel discussion on the safety of our drinking water with the Cleveland Water Commissioner, the Deputy Director of the Northeast Ohio Sewer District, and an environmentalist from the Green City Blue Lake Institute. That will be an interesting discussion with varying points of view. I guarantee you that you'll learn something from these forums. You are all invited to this morning's church upstairs at 11 o'clock. The subject is Learning for Life, and we'll cover the way we celebrate the many opportunities for spiritual and intellectual growth that we have in this church for youth and adults. Speakers will be Dr. Allan, Debbie Coombe, and Michael Carney. It's almost an extension of the discussion this morning. If any of you wish to stay a bit longer, feel free. We'll discuss the concepts and the subjects that we were discussing this morning toward the back of the room. And again, we welcome you to upstairs, the discussion at 11 o'clock, and to next Sundays and the other Sundays forums. Thank you.